Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this episode of The Black or the Berry. This week, we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk about the core differences between the transatlantic slave trade and the Trans-Saharan slave trade. Um, Last week, we got started. So, again, I'm grateful that you guys are here with me. We're going to jump in. We're going to get started. And before I do get started, I do want to say that, with both systems of both of the systems they were cruel. And then the main difference is that the Atlantic slave trade it fused, it was more race based than anything else. So, I mean, that's although we're looking at the core differences, I do want to distinguish, I do want to establish that both systems were cruel. Anytime that you're looking at another human being in terms of property to accomplish that which you want to be accomplished, it's just a cruel system. So again, both systems were very, very cruel. Nobody wants to be an indentured servant. Nobody wants to be an enslaved servant. Nobody wants to be considered anybody else's property. Um, and the main difference, when we started last week, we talked about the length of time. First off, the trans-Saharan slave trade lasted for about 10 centuries. That's 1,000 years, right? So that was the early 8th century up to the 19th. Early 8th century to the 19th centuries. So that was 1,000 years of slavery, and it differed vastly from the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was about 400 years in total, right? And one of the key differences that we look at right off the gate is we're going to look at the geography and the routes that were taken. Now, with the transatlantic slave route, it originated in the West and Central Africa, right? And it was maritime, meaning that individuals were taken from their homeland across the ocean. They were removed from an entire continent and relocated to an entirely different continent across the Atlantic Ocean, headed for the Caribbean and the Americas, right? So these people were plucked out of their native lands and expected to assimilate in a land that they had no knowledge of. They didn't know anything about the culture. They were just snatched away from home in the middle of the night, or however you want to look at it. And there were slave posts, outposts, whatever you want to call it, where these people were taken to. And again, the conditions were atrocious. A lot of the individuals didn't even survive. A lot of the individuals chose death instead of slavery. I would rather die free than to live in bondage. So again, it was the transatlantic slave trade was it involved the West and Central Africans where they were shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean. Okay, now the Trans-Saharan, and it's often what people mean when they say sub-Saharan. The more, for comparison's sake, the more proper term or politically correct term would be the Trans-Saharan slave trade. But it was, people were moved northward across the Sahara into North Africa in the Mediterranean regions and Middle Eastern network. Now, the main difference, again, we already talked about the time span. The Trans-Saharan slave trade, again, it lasted for about 1,000 years. So that system was very vast, and it differed largely, as we talked about last week. It oftentimes people were treated as concubines. These are the purposes of the trans or sub-Saharan Trans-Saharan slave trade. They were concubines. They were treated as they were enlisted in the military. We didn't see that here. So that was largely one of the main differences. But let me back up before I even jump ahead, because the time span again is it did begin many centuries earlier, operated in different forms for over 1,000 years. And here in the transatlantic slave trade, it intensified from the 16th to the 19th centuries, tied to European colonial expansion. And I find it to be interesting that anytime one group of people want to expand for whatever reason, it always involves extracting labor from somebody else. I've heard it said time and again, if you want something done right, do it yourself, right? And I'm going to say a lot of things in the course of this podcast that These are just my thoughts and these are my opinions, and I'm going to tie today's how we live today into what I'm speaking now. And one of the things that I hear in this climate in which we live is that, especially people of color, should just work harder or work or whatever the case may be. But it's a little off-putting when I hear that, because it's not that we are not willing to work. We built this nation. We didn't just become lazy. We woke up and we got tired. So we're not lazy. And if you are one who has matriculated down through a system that enslaved other people, and while they were on the plantation having to do things that you sat inside and watched them do, and if you are the descendant of someone that was in the house or watching the slaves or whatever the case may be, what they labored and you watched, I don't think you have any leg to stand on or any room to talk when you say that somebody needs to just work. Because the wealth in which you enjoy nowadays, it was not built by your hands. Just saying. So again, the transatlantic slave trade, it intensified in the 16th to the 19th century. So we're looking at about a 400-year span. And again, it was tied to European colonial expansion. Now, the economic engine behind the way they differed with the transatlantic slave trade, we know that plantation economies were fueled. You got tobacco, you got rice, you got cotton, and you got sugar, right? So the labor of the slaves, it was driving the plantation economy. And this is the setup. Again, we're going to talk a lot about scripture too here, because there's nothing new under the sun. The thing that is going on now has always gone on. I've said it again, time and again, and I'm going to continue to say this, that history does not repeat itself. We repeat history. And the reason that we repeat history is because we haven't learned the lessons of the history that has occurred before us. And in our nation, sadly, we won't learn from our history because we don't want to acknowledge and talk about it as if it were true, because it is. Slavery happened. And the reason that I'm talking about this topic on this episode is because too many times, to soften the blow or to justify the transatlantic slave trade, there are those voices that want to point to the Trans-Saharan slave trade to say, well, they had slaves in Africa. Again, I want to point out the key differences. There's plenty of literature, plenty of books that you can read about these topics. There's one, if I can find the link for it, I'll post it down below. It's the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And while I'm at it, please like, comment, subscribe to the podcast. So thank you again for that. But knowledge is power, and the information is out there. Now, again, we know that the transatlantic slave trade, it fueled the plantation economies. Plantations flourished under the labor of these slaves. I'm going to specifically, one episode, talk about the atrocities that were attached to the plantation mentality. You know, the things that the owners of the plantations were doing to their slaves beyond just utilizing them for their labor. There were so many atrocities that occurred, and there were so many heinous acts that were committed against these people that we don't talk about. That we're going to talk about the buck breaking. Excuse me, the fly past my face. We're going to talk about the buck breaking. We're going to talk about the immoral acts that the slave owners made their slaves commit in order to birth other laborers into that inhumane system of slavery, right? This is the transatlantic slave trade we're talking about. Not to say that there weren't cruelties that occurred in the trans-Saharan, but it was much less. It lasted for a longer period of time, and it was much less. It was more about servitude to families, dynasties, so to speak. It was different here in the United States. So again, in the Trans-Saharan slave trade, their economic engine, it was connected to domestic servitude, what we would say you have a maid or a butler nowadays, domestic servitude, military use. Military use, that's one of the key differences. We did not see slaves here in the transatlantic slave trade being used in any capacity in the military. Why? Because it was so atrocious, the acts of the inhumane acts that were committed against the slaves in the Americas. You can't give a slave a gun. Why? Because there will be revolts. There were slave patrols looking for slaves that were not okay with the treatment and tried to escape. So there was like an army that was patrolling the slaves, right? So we didn't have that here in the transatlantic slave trade. So that's one of the key differences right there. You had in the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, you had the indentured service that were able to be utilized in the military for their service. Again, we talked about the concubinage. There were specifically women that your job is just to be my concubine. I know I got my wife at home, but you're the side piece, and the main piece has to be okay with this. And then we talk about the psychological aspects that come along with that, the different traumas and these things that get passed down generation through generation, and it does not end. So we end up repeating history because we don't learn from it. Again, in the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, it was about administration and regional labor systems, and it varied by what region you were in, what time frame it was and what place you were in. So those are the major differences that we're looking at in terms of the economic engine. And then we talk about the scale and the industrialization. And when we're looking at the transatlantic here in the United States, it again was highly systematized. It was a system that persists today. Even by another name, it persists today. It was built on, it was a highly racial system then and still now. Okay, it was maritime, meaning it involved crossing the ocean, bringing these slaves from their home continent to a brand new continent altogether here in the Americas and the Caribbean or Caribbean. Again, and it was racialized and it was on a massive scale. So the brutality, the slave owners had to break the slaves. Again, that's where the term buck breaking came from, where the most dominant of the male slaves were sodomized and taunted by the plantation owners and all the plantation owners, right? And we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about the breedings that occurred on these plantations, and not just the masters or the plantation owners making the slaves one husband breed with another wife or vice versa, and have multiple families only to strip the kids away to be replaced, or not replaced, but to be sold further into slavery, sent to other places, never to see their own family again. We're going to talk about we're gonna dig deep into this because it's a rich topic, and it's one that we have not even begun to understand because we're not honest enough to talk about it. So we're going to look at all of these things, the immorality that occurred, and just the evil behind the system. With the Trans-Saharan, again, it was brutal also. It was brutal. Anytime you have people that are involved in the system, it's going to be imperfect, brutal. It's going to mimic exactly all the attitudes and the behaviors of the people, right? So we're going to look at that. It was typically less industrialized. It was not centered on plantation chattel in the same way as the slavery as we know in the transatlantic slave trade. The chattel slavery was more dominant here in the transatlantic side of things. This is when people were considered to be property. As we said before, in the transatlantic slave trade, a baby was born into slavery, not free when he was born. In the Trans-Saharan slave trade, you got your freedom at some point. There was something that was common knowledge. You are going to get your freedom. You are not born into a system of slavery that you're going to always be tied down to. That's one of the key differences. But again, we don't want to talk about that. And then we're going to look at the racial ideology The transatlantic slave trade, this is very key that we hear this because of the way, and this is one of the major reasons why we don't want to talk about history, because there's justification in the attitudes and the behaviors of Black and brown people. Let's just say Black, because we were the ones that were in slavery mostly. The transatlantic slave trade helped to harden the anti-Black racial hierarchies in hereditary chattel slavery in the Americas. This is where Black people had to be treated as inhumane, or that was the perception of the slave masters. We can't treat them as our equals. We have got to dominate them. We have got to make them become submissive to us. And when you break the mind, the will, and the emotions, or try to bend the mind, the will, and the emotions of a group of people to assimilate to your ways, to extract something from them, there's a lot that goes into that. There's a whole lot that goes into that. The psychological aspect, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the post-traumatic slave disorder or the post-traumatic slave syndrome. We're going to talk about that because although slavery ended years ago on paper, it has persisted. Today, slavery has a new name. We'll talk about that too. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So again, the racial ideology in the transatlantic, again, it helped to harden the modern anti-Black racial hierarchies and hereditary chattel slavery in the Americas. Now, as far as the Trans-Saharan slave trade, is based on ethnicity, religion, status, and the region where it often mattered alongside race. Systems varied across empires and centuries. So we're talking about empires over centuries that it was about standing. It was about status. It was about the prestige of it all. But the slaves, even in the Trans-Saharan system, there were slave owners that if one, of course, you had some slave owners that were, their attitude toward their slaves, they didn't look at them as if, again, they were property. They were not, the institution itself was horrible. It was evil. It was brutal. But in the system in the Trans-Saharan, there was more humane treatment in a sense overall throughout the centuries, as opposed to what we came to understand and experience or learn about in the transatlantic slave trade. There are attitudes, there are personalities, if you will, that have been shaped into what they are today, centered around slavery. And there's a psychological understanding behind it that is quite easy to talk about, but nobody wants to get off the surface and go deep and really talk about the things. In order for a thing to heal, it has to be addressed. It has to be dissected on so many different levels. And slavery, we know how bad it was. And that is why a lot of voices want to get quiet. That is why a lot of people want to delete certain parts of the history from the United States. But again, if we don't talk about these things, there is no American history. I'm sorry, there is no world history. There is no American history if we're not talking about Black history, because the contributions are there. They're undeniable. They've always been there. And it is worth talking about. Now, where it comes down to the chattel status in the transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement often became inherited by children, by law, in many colonies. So again, slaves were never free. Even the generations that followed, their children, their children's children, if there was a debt that wasn't settled in one generation, it was passed down. So imagine being born with a noose around your neck, and the moment that you think you can come up for air, you're only drugged down again, even lower. So it didn't skip. It passed from one generation to the next. So it was like the debt was never forgiven, right? It was never forgiven. And if we go back to earlier, I alluded to history doesn't repeat itself, we repeat history. Let's look at slavery as it occurred in the Bible. God had to raise Moses up to go down to Egypt to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And they were using them in much the same way, not as inhumane as I would say the slaves in the transatlantic slave trade happened, but he sent Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh was so stubborn that God himself had to send many different plagues to finally get his point through. So it was not, slavery was not good then, and it's still not good now. Anytime that I, again, try to bend the will of a group of people to fit my own narrative, that is wrong. That is wrong. And over the years, to soften the blow and the stink behind slavery, we've been given a version of, we've been fed a lot of lies, scripturally speaking. And there are pastors in the pulpit that are even now mimicking these lies because they lack the understanding of the truth of just what this institution was. So again, excuse me, the Trans-Saharan slave trade practices varied more widely. Some of the enslaved people could assimilate. Imagine that. They didn't have water fountains later, and this happened later on. They didn't have separate water fountains. They didn't have separate accommodations. They were oftentimes treated as family. But that's another story. But they could assimilate, they could gain status, or they could be manumitted depending on context. They had rights. Transatlantic slave trade slaves did not have rights. We don't want to talk about 1965, basically, when certain the Voting Rights Act and different things of that nature, rights that we were just as a people granted in 1965. And again, we still, although we have rights on paper according to the Constitution, it's still a system, slavery by a new name. The new Jim Crow, blacks are still being oppressed because it is about a system. We talked about that earlier. It's a system that has been etched in stone, and it's just been reinvented time and again. And we see that with this current administration. Now, in terms of the historical legacy for the transatlantic slave trade, it was directly shaped, or it has directly shaped the Americas. The assimilation and the diaspora, the cultures, the different wealth gaps and modern racism, that has happened in this transatlantic slave trade. This is why there are so many voices that have dissented and voices that have been speaking up for so long. And there are those that want to talk about, well, why do we continue to talk about racism? We're going to continue to talk about the thing that is because it is. And if you live in denial about the fact that something is, it doesn't make it a lie. There are those, if you experience racism long enough, you know what it looks like. You know what it smells like, even when you see it. And unfortunately, you even know what it tastes like. But if you're one of the ones that perpetrate, or yet you are a part of that system and you're trying to oppress another group, even if the mentality of the slave was psychologically passed down, then the mentality of the masters will pass down to the generations of their children. And then we have modern day kids that are descendants of these masters of the plantation, that they know that these atrocities occurred and were bad, but if I just don't talk about it, then I'm not like that. No, you are what you are. Not talking about it doesn't make it not true. So we have got to be willing to, at the end of the day, one of the main reasons why here in the United States we don't want to talk about the reparations to blacks, we don't really care about the 40 acres and a mule. Yeah, Andrew Jackson or whoever it was that signed the law, fact check me down below. I think it was Andrew Jackson with the 40 acres and a mule. I can't remember which president it was. I want to say it was him. We were promised 40 acres and a mule. We never got it. Reparations, restitution. We understand why there are so many voices against and people against reparations where blacks are concerned. We could talk about that also. I can't allow you access to power, because if I allow you access to power, the thing that I have done to you, you are going to revisit this and do the same to me. That is the fearful thinking of the master and the master's children that has been passed down. Which is why, again, the conditioning, I got to recondition these people to think that there's something that they're really not. Again, you can try to convince a dog all day long that it's a cat, and it may look as if it's working, but at some point in time, the nature, the DNA, the buildup of that thing is going to show and prove that it is what it is. So it's going to be what it is. So at the end of the day, there's that muscle memory that is etched into the DNA of the slave that say, you know what, I'm not from here. I know where I come from. And it's just things begin to shake, things begin to happen, things begin to move. And again, it's going to continue to be unsettled until we address the things that need to be settled. There's always going to be that disconnect. There's also going to be that discord if we never talk about the thing that broke us apart in the first place. Again, if I was there as a part of the problem, I have to be willing to come to the table to be a part of the solution. I don't care how bad it hurt. It has to be done. And if it has to be done, it has to be done by the players that were engaged in the act. So yeah, the white man that had his opportunity, or that had the position of being the slave owner. You got the black people that are in the unfortunate position of being slaves. So that means we got to bring whites and blacks back to the table if we're going to have a meaningful conversation and a meaningful understanding as to how can we resolve this? How can we make this? How can we amend our actions? How can we atone for this? But that conversation doesn't want to be had. Why? Because a lot of people know that it's tied to the reparations, and true amendment is going to bring about some type of financial compensation. But again, we'll dive deeper into that on the next go around as well. I didn't have a whole lot that I was going to give you guys tonight, because again, I want to stay organized, and I don't want to get scatterbrained and go all over the place. But I do have some wonderful ideas in terms of the podcast. I want to start a book club, but we'll talk about that later. That's not for now, that's for later. But again, I just wanted to drop in tonight and continue on the core differences when we talk about distinguishing the transatlantic slave trade versus the trans-Saharan slave trade, so that we can stop hearing people use the one to justify the other, because these two things are completely and totally separate. Although both were very brutal and neither system was good. It was good for those that were in positions of power, but not for those who were being exploited for their labor. Again, this has been the second episode of The Black of the Berry, my new venture that I'm loving. I appreciate the fact that you're on this journey with me. Again, if I say anything, fact check me down below, like, comment, and share. And I expect to see you guys back here next week, same time, same place. Thank you. Looking forward to seeing you next week.